The cardboard box in Logan Carter's arms held almost nothing: a coffee mug, a phone charger, a single folder. He walked out through the front entrance of Harrison Global's headquarters, while laughter trailed behind him from the open office floor, sharp and unhurried, the kind people allow themselves when they are certain they have already won. Vanessa Brooks stood near the glass doors, arms crossed, wearing the quiet smile of someone who had just solved a problem. Logan stepped onto the front stairs, reached into his pocket, and pulled out his phone. He made one call. His voice was level, almost casual. "Fire every one of them." Within minutes, the building behind him began to collapse from the inside. Logan Carter had been back in the United States for less than 3 weeks when he walked into Harrison Global's downtown headquarters, carrying nothing but a leather messenger bag and a name that meant nothing to anyone in that building. That was exactly how he wanted it. He had spent the last several years working overseas, supply chain, consulting, operational restructuring, the kind of unglamorous work that required long hours and short expectations. He had learned more from that experience than from any boardroom meeting he had ever sat in. And when his father called to say the time had come, Logan did not ask for the chairman's office. He asked for a desk on the 14th floor and a standard employee badge with no special access. His father, Harrison Carter, had built the company from a regional logistics firm into one of the largest privately held conglomerates in the country over the course of 4 decades. The man was 71 years old, deliberate in everything he did, and had spent the last 2 years preparing for a transition that most people inside the company did not know was already in motion. Harrison had one condition: whoever took the seat after him had to understand the company from the ground up, not from above. Logan agreed without argument. It was the same philosophy that had guided his entire working life. So Logan showed up on a Monday morning in plain dark trousers, a simple button-down shirt and shoes that were clean but not expensive. He introduced himself to the HR coordinator as a new operations associate on temporary assignment. The coordinator, a quiet man named Greg, handed him a badge, pointed him toward the 14th floor, and went back to his paperwork. Nobody looked twice. That was the point. The 14th floor housed the mid-level operations team project, coordinators, data analysts, compliance officers, and a small cluster of administrative staff who handled internal reporting and vendor communications. It was not the most glamorous floor in the building, but Logan had specifically requested it. The work done there was the connective tissue of the company. If something was wrong with the culture of Harrison Global, it would show up on the 14th floor before it showed up anywhere else. His direct supervisor was Vanessa Brooks. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, efficient in the way people become when they have held a position long enough to know exactly how little effort is required to maintain it. She wore authority like a tailored jacket, fitted deliberate and slightly too tight for anyone else to borrow. On Logan's first day, she looked him over once and said without particular interest that he would be handling data consolidation for the quarterly compliance report. She handed him a stack of documents that were already 3 days overdue and walked away before he could respond. Logan sat down, opened the stack, and got to work. The data was a mess: inconsistent formatting, missing source tags, duplicated entries across departments. It was not difficult to fix, just tedious and time-consuming. He spent most of that first day in silence working through the documents, while the rest of the floor moved around him. He noticed early on that the team functioned in a particular social geography. There was an inner circle, Vanessa at the center, flanked closely by Derek Walsh and Paula Simmons, and then there was everyone else. The distinction was not subtle. Derek was loud, loose with opinions, and had a talent for saying things that sounded like jokes, but weren't. Paula was quieter but more precise, the kind of person who watched everything and said only what was necessary to stay aligned with whoever held the most influence in the room. By the end of his first week, Logan had completed 3 assignments that were originally divided among 4 people. He had not announced this. He simply put the finished reports in the shared drive with clean formatting and moved on. 2 days later, He overheard Derek telling Vanessa that the consolidated vendor report, the one Logan had spent 12 hours restructuring, had been praised by the compliance director. Derek took credit for it without hesitation, without even a flicker of discomfort. Vanessa nodded approvingly and CC'd Derek on the follow-up email to senior leadership. Logan's name did not appear anywhere in the chain. He read the email, closed his laptop, and went to get a cup of coffee. He was not surprised. He was paying attention. Over the following 2 weeks, a pattern established itself with very little variation. Any work Logan completed that produced a good result would be claimed by someone else, usually Derek or Paula, sometimes Vanessa herself. Any process that went wrong, a delayed response, a misrouted file, a miscommunication between departments, would find its way to Logan's desk as his fault, regardless of whether he had been involved. The floor had a well-worn system for this. Errors needed a name attached to them before they reached Vanessa, and the name attached was almost always a person with the least standing to push back. Logan was that person, and he had chosen to remain that person for now. There were moments that were harder to absorb than others. One afternoon, a compliance analyst named Ruth, a woman in her early 30s, who had been at the company for 6 years, made a formatting error in a regulatory submission. The error was minor and easily corrected, but Vanessa called it out in the middle of the open floor in front of the entire team, her voice carrying enough edge to make sure everyone heard. Ruth sat very still, her face controlled, and said yes. She understood. She would correct it immediately. After Vanessa walked away, Ruth stared at her screen for a long moment without moving. Logan watched that moment and filed it away alongside everything else he had been collecting. What struck him was not the correction itself, but the way Ruth absorbed it, the practiced stillness of someone who had learned that any visible reaction would be used against her. There was also a quieter kind of cruelty that ran beneath the surface. Lunch plans that were made just loudly enough for Logan to hear, then finalized in a way that made clear he was not included. Questions directed at him in meetings that were designed not to gather information, but to expose gaps, phrased carefully publicly, so that any stumble became a data point in the running case against his competence. Requests that arrived at 4:50 in the afternoon for deliverables due by the following morning, never with enough context to complete them cleanly, always with enough ambiguity to assign blame if something went wrong. None of it rose to the level of a formal complaint on its own. That was the sophistication of it. Each incident could be explained away individually. Together, they formed something much more deliberate. Logan ran 5 miles most mornings before the sun came up. He had learned to use early hours for thinking, not just exercise. On those runs, he processed what he was seeing without the noise of the office around him. He had gone into this arrangement expecting to find the ordinary friction of corporate life, politics inefficiency, the occasional personality conflict. What he was finding instead was a managed ecosystem. The bullying on the 14th floor was not casual or disorganized. It was institutional. It had a structure, a hierarchy, and a shared understanding among its participants about what was permitted and what was protected. People lower in the hierarchy either participated or stayed silent, because silence was the only form of neutrality the environment allowed. He thought about his father's company, not as a chairman's son, but as someone who had spent years studying organizations and what made them function or fail. A company could have excellent products, strong financials, and a well-regarded brand, while rotting in the middle floor by floor team, by team one, silenced employee at a time. Harrison Global had been built on a different idea. His father had said more than once that a company's real value was not on the balance sheet, but in whether the people inside it trusted each other. Logan had understood that as a principle for most of his life. He was only now seeing what it looked like when the opposite was true. In his 3rd week, Vanessa assigned him to lead the documentation for a sensitive internal data audit. It was more responsibility than anything he had been given before, and he took it seriously. He built the tracking system from scratch coordinated with 3 separate departments, and had the initial framework ready 2 days ahead of schedule. He shared access with Vanessa and Derek, so the broader team could continue building on it while he completed the final sections. It was a reasonable and professional decision. He would come to understand later exactly how it was used against him. On a Thursday morning, Logan arrived at the office to find Derek and Paula already in Vanessa's glass-walled office. The blinds were drawn, which was unusual. HR Director Sandra Pruitt was also there, seated across from Vanessa, with a folder open in front of her. Logan had barely set down his bag when Sandra stepped out and asked him to come in. Her expression was the practiced neutrality of someone delivering information they did not write. Vanessa stood to the side, arms folded. Derek sat in the corner with the specific stillness of a person who already knows how a scene ends. Sandra told him that a significant volume of restricted client data had been accessed and extracted from the audit system over the past 48 hours. The activity had originated from the access credentials Logan had used to build the tracking framework. There was, she said, a clear audit trail. The company's position was that a serious breach of data security had occurred, and given the evidence, they could not in good conscience continue his employment. Logan asked if he could see the audit trail. Sandra looked at Vanessa. Vanessa said that the documentation was being held by the legal department, pending further review, and that it was not available to him at this time. Logan asked if there was a process for contesting the decision. Sandra said that, given the nature of the incident, the termination was immediate and final. She slid a single-page document across the desk and asked him to sign it, acknowledging receipt of the termination notice. Logan looked at the document for a moment, then signed it. He asked for a copy, which Sandra provided. He thanked her. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Vanessa or Derek. He picked up his bag, walked back to his desk, and placed his coffee mug, his charger, and the one folder he kept there into the small cardboard box that Sandra had left beside his chair. The floor was very quiet. People were watching without appearing to watch. Logan carried the box to the elevator, rode it down to the lobby, and walked out through the front entrance into the afternoon light. He stood at the top of the entrance stairs. The glass doors behind him reflected the pale sky. He set the box down on the concrete railing, reached into his pocket, and pulled out his phone. He scrolled to a contact saved under a single initial and pressed call. The line connected on the second ring. Logan's voice was even unhurried entirely without anger. He said 3 sentences. The first was an instruction to contact the general counsel and convene the board within the hour. The second was a request to have the full digital record of the 14th floor, every email, every access log, every performance review for the past 4 years, placed under immediate legal hold. The third sentence was the one that would echo through every corridor of that building before the day was over. Fire every one of them. He ended the call, picked up his box, and walked toward the parking structure. Behind him, through the glass doors, the lobby was already beginning to change. The call lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Logan sat in his car in the parking structure beneath Harrison Global, with the engine off and the cardboard box on the passenger seat. The general counsel, Martin Cole, had picked up before the second ring, which told Logan that his father had already been in contact. Martin was measured and professional, but there was an urgency in his voice that he did not fully conceal. Logan told him what he needed: the legal hold on all digital records going back 4 years the board convened within the hour, and a complete blackout on his identity until he gave the signal. Martin said he understood. Logan ended the call and sat in the quiet of the concrete structure for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. He was not angry. That surprised some people when they heard the story later, but it would not have surprised anyone who knew him well. Anger required surprise, and Logan had not been surprised by anything that happened on the 14th floor. He had been watching it build for 3 weeks. What he felt sitting in that car was something closer to clarity, the kind that arrives when a problem you have been studying finally reveals its full shape, and you understand exactly what it requires. He drove home, changed his shirt, and was back in the building 40 minutes later. This time he did not enter through the front lobby. He took the executive elevator from the private parking level, used the access code his father had given him on his first day back in the country, and rode it directly to the 32nd floor, where the boardroom and the executive offices occupied the entire western face of the building. The view from up there looked out over the city in a way that the 14th floor never did. Logan had always thought that was part of the problem. With how most companies were structured, the people at the top spent too much time looking outward and not enough time looking down at what was happening inside. Harrison Carter was already in the boardroom when Logan arrived. The old man was standing at the head of the long table, not seated, because Harrison Carter did not sit in meetings when he was agitated. He was dressed as always in a dark suit with no tie, his white hair trimmed close, his posture carrying the particular straightness of someone who had never entirely stopped being military in his bearing, even decades after the fact. He looked at his son when Logan walked in, and something in the set of his expression shifted, not quite relief, but something adjacent to it. Martin Cole was already there with 2 members of the legal team. 2 board members had dialed in remotely and appeared on the screen at the far end of the room. Sandra Pruitt, the HR director, who had delivered Logan's termination notice just hours earlier, had also been summoned. She sat at the far end of the table with the careful composure of someone who understood that her position in this room had changed significantly since that morning. Harrison did not open the meeting with pleasantries. He confirmed the legal hold was in place, that IT security had already been pulled in to run a parallel audit of the data access logs, and that nobody on the 14th floor had been informed of any change. The building continued to function exactly as it had 2 hours ago. The 14th floor believed they had won. Logan stood at the table and walked through the last 3 weeks without notes. He described the pattern of work misappropriation, the deliberate assignment of blame, the fabricated data breach. He told them about Ruth, about the 450 deadlines, about the email chain where Derek took credit for 12 hours of Logan's work. Sandra listened to this without expression, but Logan saw her hand tighten slightly on the folder in front of her. She had been given a document that morning and asked to deliver it without being allowed to examine the underlying evidence. That much was apparent. Martin's team had already begun pulling the access logs. Within the first 30 minutes of examination, the trail was clear. The data extraction flagged as Logan's had been initiated through his credentials, but the originating device did not match any machine he had ever logged in from. The IP address resolved to a workstation registered to Derek Walsh. Someone had obtained Logan's credentials and used them from Derek's terminal. It was not a sophisticated operation. It was the kind of thing that worked because the people doing it had never been seriously examined before. Martin set the preliminary findings on the table and said simply that the framing was unambiguous. The legal team would need another few hours to compile the complete picture, but what they already had was sufficient to act. Harrison looked at Logan and asked him how he wanted to proceed. Logan said he wanted to proceed with the all-hands meeting as planned, and he wanted the evidence presented without any announcement of his identity beforehand. His father nodded once. Sandra was instructed to prepare the company-wide meeting notice and to say nothing beyond what the notice contained. The all-hands meeting was called for 4 o'clock. The notice went out company-wide through the internal communication system, all staff, all floors, mandatory attendance in the main atrium. The message was brief. The founding chairman had an announcement regarding the company's future leadership. Nothing more. In the 2 hours between the notice and the meeting, the building hummed with speculation. On the 14th floor, Vanessa held court near the window bank, speaking in the low, confident register of someone who considered themselves adjacent to important information. She mentioned twice that transitions like this were usually opportunities for people who had demonstrated real value to the organization. Derek laughed at something she said. Paula refreshed her email. None of them connected the meeting to the termination they had executed that morning, and none of them noticed that Sandra Pruitt had not returned to the floor after her morning meeting. The atrium on the ground floor of Harrison Global was designed for exactly this kind of gathering high ceilings, a raised platform at the north end, enough floor space to hold the entire company standing. By 3:50, the room was full. Logan stood in a side corridor off the platform, with Martin Cole watching the crowd through a narrow gap in the partition. He could see Vanessa near the center of the room, positioned with the easy confidence of someone who expected to hear good news. Derek stood beside her. Paula was a few feet back, arms crossed, watching the stage. Harrison Carter walked onto the platform at 4 o'clock with the unhurried authority of a man who had been doing this for 40 years. The room settled immediately. He spoke without a microphone for the first sentence, and then someone adjusted the sound system, and his voice filled the space. He thanked the company for its work over the decades. He said that building Harrison Global had been the defining project of his life, and that handing it to the right person was the most important decision he had left to make. He said he had spent a long time thinking about what kind of leader this company needed, not just someone who understood the financials or the strategy, but someone who understood what it actually meant to work here at every level, in every condition. He said the next chairman of Harrison Global had been inside this building for the past 3 weeks. He asked his son to come forward. Logan walked onto the platform. He wore the same clothes he had been fired in that morning, the plain dark trousers, the simple button-down, the clean but unremarkable shoes. He carried nothing. He stood beside his father and looked out at the atrium, and the silence that came over the room was total. It was the specific silence of several hundred people processing something that did not fit any category they had prepared for. Vanessa's face from the distance of the platform went through several changes in rapid succession: recognition first, then calculation, then something that had no clean name. Logan watched it happen and felt nothing reactive. He had not come up here to enjoy this moment. He had come up here to begin the work. He did not deliver a speech. He introduced himself, his name, his background. In brief, his father's intention and the fact that he had requested to begin his time at Harrison Global as an ordinary employee. He said that decision had been the most instructive 3 weeks of his professional life. He said he had learned a great deal about the company, and that some of what he had learned required immediate attention. He thanked his father, stepped to the side, and asked Martin Cole to take the floor. Martin was precise and unhurried, in the way that lawyers become when they are presenting findings they are fully confident in. He explained that in connection with a personnel matter that had occurred earlier in the day, the legal department had initiated a review of records from the 14th floor operations team. He said the review had uncovered evidence of a fabricated data breach used to terminate an employee without cause, and that further examination of the records was already revealing a broader pattern of conduct that the company took very seriously. He said the review would be completed within 24 hours, and that all relevant personnel had been placed on administrative suspension, effective immediately pending outcome. He named no one from the platform. The notification to those individuals would be delivered directly. The atrium did not erupt. It went very still in the way that spaces do when the thing being said is significant enough that people stop performing their reactions and simply absorb it. Logan stood on the platform and looked out at the room and thought about Ruth sitting at her desk with a controlled face absorbing a public humiliation that had nothing to do with her competence. He thought about the other people on that floor who had been enduring this for years, watching staying quiet, calculating what it would cost them to speak. He thought about what it meant that not one of them had felt safe enough to file a complaint that went anywhere. That was not a coincidence. That was by design. After the meeting ended and the atrium began to empty, Logan remained on the platform for a moment while the room cleared. One of the legal team members handed him a preliminary summary of the records already reviewed. He read through it, standing there, with the noise of the departing crowd still moving around him. The document was 12 pages. He read all of it. What the record showed was worse than what he had personally observed. The manipulation of performance evaluations went back 4 years. There were documented instances of Vanessa approving negative reviews for employees who had filed informal complaints about the team's working environment. 2 of those employees had subsequently left the company. 1 had accepted a settlement. The credit stealing was systematic project attribution, had been rerouted through the team's internal reporting in ways that were deliberate and consistent. Derek Walsh appeared in more than 30 instances. Paula Simmons in 19. Vanessa Brooks was present in all of it, in one form or another, either directly or as the approving authority. Logan handed the summary back to the legal team member and asked how long the full audit would take. The answer was 12 to 16 hours for the complete documentation. Logan said he would be in at 6 the following morning. He walked off the platform through the now empty atrium and into the corridor that led to the executive elevator. The building around him was quiet in a different way than it had been that morning. This quiet had weight to it. He rode the elevator up alone. The day had begun with him carrying a cardboard box out through the front entrance, and it was ending with him returning to a floor he had never officially occupied. The circumstances had reversed completely, but Logan did not feel the satisfaction that a reversal was supposed to produce. What he felt instead was the particular gravity of a decision that had not yet been made, one that would determine more than any announcement or audit finding what kind of leader he was actually going to be. Tomorrow morning, he would have to look at the full record and determine exactly what justice looked like, not for himself, but for every person on that floor who had spent years making themselves small enough to survive. That was the decision that would define his chairmanship before it had properly begun. Logan was at his desk on the 32nd floor by 5:55 the following morning. The city outside the windows was still gray, the early light not yet strong enough to define the skyline. Martin Cole arrived at 6:10 with the completed audit in a bound folder and a second copy on a secure drive. He set both on the desk without ceremony and took the chair across from Logan. They worked through the findings together for the next 2 hours, Martin walking through each section while Logan read and asked questions. The full picture was more organized than Logan had expected and more damaging. The audit covered 4 years of records, the same 4 years that had been placed under legal hold the previous afternoon. In that time, the group operating under Vanessa Brooks had suppressed the advancement of at least 11 employees through manipulated evaluation scores. 3 of those employees had filed informal complaints through internal channels. All 3 complaints had been routed, whether by design or by the structural failure of the reporting system, back to Vanessa's level, where they were documented as resolved without any meaningful investigation. 1 employee had left the company after receiving a sudden and poorly substantiated negative review that appeared in their file within 2 weeks of raising a concern. Another had been quietly transferred to a different floor after what the records described only as a personnel discussion. The third had accepted a confidential settlement. None of the 3 had been contacted by the company since. Sandra Pruitt's name appeared in 2 of the 3 complaint files as the HR contact, a detail that Logan noted without comment and set aside for a separate conversation. Beyond the individual cases, the data showed a consistent pattern in how project work was documented and attributed. Logan had witnessed the beginning of this process in his 3 weeks on the floor, the rerouting of credit, the selective inclusion of names in communications to senior leadership. The records confirmed it had been deliberate and sustained. Derek Walsh's name appeared in favorable project summaries at a rate that bore no relationship to his documented contributions. Paula Simmons had served in effect as the administrative mechanism of the scheme, managing the internal paperwork in ways that made the misattribution difficult to trace without the kind of systematic review that had never previously been conducted. Vanessa sat above all of it, approving, authorizing, occasionally directing. Her fingerprints were not always on the surface, but they were in the structure. Logan closed the folder and looked at the window for a moment. Then he asked Martin what the legal exposure looked like if the company chose not to act decisively. Martin said it was significant, and growing the settled employee alone represented a liability that could be reopened if it became known that the company had evidence of systemic misconduct and elected to manage it quietly. The two employees who had left after filing complaints were potentially in the same category. Logan said that was not the direction he was considering. Martin said he understood. The decision Logan had been turning over since the previous evening was not whether to act. That was already settled. The question was scope. Firing Vanessa, Derek, and Paula was straightforward. The evidence against them was specific and documented. But the audit had also identified 4 other members of the team who had participated in the pattern at varying levels of involvement. Some actively, some through deliberate silence that had protected the scheme rather than disrupted it. Logan had read each of their files individually the night before, sitting at his desk well past midnight, with the preliminary summary spread across the table. 2 of those 4 had themselves been targets of Vanessa's team in earlier years, before apparently finding it easier to align with the structure than to resist it. That history did not absolve them, but it complicated the question of what accountability looked like when the environment itself had been designed to make integrity costly. He also considered Sandra Pruitt carefully. Her role in the complaint filings was a matter of record. Whether she had actively suppressed those complaints or had simply failed to escalate them was a distinction the audit could document, but not fully resolve. Logan decided that Sandra would remain in her position under a formal review process, with the understanding that the outcome of that review would determine her future at the company. It was a harder line to draw than the others, but it was the right one. Acting on incomplete evidence in either direction would set the wrong precedent for how decisions were made under his leadership. He spent another hour with the files before calling Martin back in. He told Martin that the terminations would cover Vanessa Brooks, Derek Walsh, Paula Simmons, and the 4 additional team members whose participation was documented in the audit. He said the language of the termination notices would be specific. Each person would receive documentation identifying the precise conduct that led to the decision, not a generic separation notice. He said the 2 former employees who had filed complaints and left the company would be contacted directly by the legal team within the week, and that the company would make them whole. The employee who had accepted a settlement would be contacted as well. Logan said he wanted that process handled with care, not speed. The goal was to make it right, not to close it quickly. Martin made notes and did not ask unnecessary questions. Before he left, he confirmed that the administrative suspension notices had been delivered to all 7 individuals the previous evening. Logan nodded and said he wanted the formal terminations processed by end of business that day. By 9 o'clock, the building had begun to fill. Logan rode the elevator down to the 14th floor for the first time since his termination the morning before. He had not announced the visit. He walked off the elevator and stood for a moment in the open area near the entrance to the floor, looking at the space, the rows of desks, the glass-walled offices along the far wall, the window bank, where Vanessa had stood the day before, speaking in the low, confident register of someone who believed the future was organized in her favor. The desks belonging to Vanessa, Derek, and Paula were empty and would remain so. The rest of the floor was at half capacity. People had arrived, but were not working, not really. They were waiting. Logan walked to the center of the floor and asked if everyone could gather. It took less than a minute. The remaining members of the team arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, some standing, some pulling chairs, all of them watching him with the careful attention of people who had learned that expressions were not free. Logan did not stand behind anything, no podium, no desk. He stood in the open space of the floor and spoke at a normal volume, which was enough for everyone to hear. He said he wanted to be direct about what had happened and what was going to happen. He told them that the audit was complete, that the termination decisions had been made, and that those decisions were final. He said he was not there to explain himself or to seek their approval. He was there because the people in this room had worked in a particular environment for years, and some of them had been harmed by it, and he thought they deserved to hear from him directly rather than through a company memo. He said the evaluation system that had been in place on this floor was being suspended immediately, and that every performance record from the past 4 years would be reviewed by an independent HR team before any of it was used for any purpose going forward. He said that if anyone in the room had concerns, documented experiences, or information they had been holding on to, there would be a formal reporting channel open within the week 1 that would not route back through any manager. It would go directly to the legal department and to him. He asked if anyone had questions. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Ruth, the analyst, who had been publicly corrected at her desk in front of the entire team, raised her hand. She asked whether the review of performance records would affect decisions that had already been made, promotions that had been denied, roles that people had been passed over for. Logan said yes. He said the review was specifically designed to identify and correct those outcomes where the record showed the evaluation had been influenced by the conduct under investigation. Ruth nodded and lowered her hand. She did not say anything else, but something in the set of her expression changed, not dramatically, just a slight release of something that had been held carefully in place for a long time. Logan noticed it. He did not comment on it, but he noticed it. A man near the back of the group, one of the project coordinators, who had been on the floor for nearly 3 years, raised his hand next and asked whether people who had stayed silent would be penalized. It was a fair question, and Logan answered it directly. He said the review was focused on documented participation in the misconduct, not on silence. He said he understood that staying silent in that environment had not been a neutral choice. It had been a survival choice, and that he was not interested in punishing people for calculating what it would cost them to speak when the system gave them no safe way to do so. What he was interested in was making sure that calculation never had to happen again. The coordinator nodded and lowered his hand. A few people around him visibly exhaled. Logan spent the rest of that morning moving through the building, floor by floor. He had not scheduled the visits in advance. He showed up, asked people to gather, and had the same conversation he had on the 14th floor. What had happened, what was being done, what would be different, and what they could expect from him. Some floors were more guarded than others. Some people asked questions. Most listened. A few looked at him with the specific skepticism of people who had heard promises from leadership before and were not yet prepared to adjust their expectations. Logan did not ask them to trust him. He told them what he was doing, and he left it at that. In the afternoon, Vanessa called the main legal line and asked to speak with Logan directly. Martin relayed the message and asked Logan how he wanted to handle it. Logan said to put her through. The call lasted 11 minutes. Vanessa did not begin with an apology. She began with context, the pressure she had been under, the expectations. From above, the competitive nature of the environment she had inherited when she took the management role. Logan listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said that he had read the full audit, including the records that predated the most recent incidents, and that the pattern it documented was not a product of external pressure. It was a choice sustained over 4 years that had damaged real people's careers, and in some cases, their livelihoods. He said the decision would not change. Vanessa said that she had given the company 8 years. Logan said he understood, and that the severance terms the legal team had provided were consistent with her contract and with the company's obligations. He thanked her for the call and ended it. Derek did not call. Paula sent a written message through her personal attorney requesting reconsideration on the basis that her role had been administrative rather than directive. Martin's team responded in writing with the relevant sections of the audit attached. By the end of the first week, the independent HR review had begun. Logan had established a direct reporting line that bypassed the existing middle management structure, while new team leads were identified and vetted. He had also quietly restored 2 employees to roles they had been passed over for pending the full review. Neither of them had been told the complete reason, only that the company had reevaluated the decision and wanted to discuss a different path forward. Both agreed to meet. Both accepted. Harrison Carter came to the office on Friday afternoon. He did not come for any scheduled purpose. He came. Logan understood simply to be present. The old man walked the building with his son for about an hour, moving floor by floor, asking questions, and listening to the answers, not offering guidance unless it was requested. At the end of the walk, they stood together near the window on the 32nd floor, looking out at the city in the late afternoon light. Harrison said that he had spent 4 decades building something and had been afraid, in the last few years, that it had begun to come apart in ways he could not fully see from where he sat. Logan said he understood that now. Harrison said he did not doubt that Logan would handle it correctly. Logan said he wasn't certain of that, but he intended to stay close to the floor, to keep looking at what was actually happening, not just at what the report said was happening. Harrison nodded slowly. That was, he said, exactly the right instinct. It had always been the right instinct. He had simply stopped trusting it in himself when the company grew large enough that looking down became uncomfortable. The cardboard box that Logan had carried out through the front entrance 2 weeks earlier was still in the back seat of his car. He had not thought to bring it upstairs in the days since. One evening after the building had emptied, and the only light left on the 32nd floor was the one above his desk, he went down to the parking level and brought it up. He set it on the corner of his desk and opened it. The coffee mug he put on the windowsill, the phone charger he plugged in, the folder he filed in the cabinet beside the desk. They were not significant objects, but they were the things he had carried out of a situation designed to make him feel like he did not belong there, and there was something worth keeping in having them visible. A leader was not remembered for the moment they revealed their power. They were remembered for what they chose to do with it, who they protected, who they made whole, and what kind of place they left behind for the people who would still be there long after the names on the termination notices had faded from memory. Logan understood that now, in a way he had not fully understood, before he walked through that front entrance in plain clothes and asked for a desk on the 14th floor. The work had just begun. But it had begun honestly, and that was the only foundation that had ever held anything of real value together.